One of the largest airlines in the US, Delta, was among the first few companies to express interest in the 797 back in the day publicly. Slotting into the middle of the market space, this prospective clean sheet single aisle would have looked to replace the 757 and the 767. However, the 797 was never released in the end, and it left Delta without the plane it desired. So what happened? What's the aircraft? And what's next for the major company? Firstly, much attention surrounded the 797 program, I'd argue, throughout the latter stages of the 2010s, during which analysts certainly put forward their view that Boeing was at a critical juncture, a crossroads if you will, a T-intersection. Was it going to turn left and launch the plane, or turn right and not? If Boeing had decided to proceed with the 797, the consensus was the jet would have, for its size and capabilities, fit perfectly between the 737 MAX and the 787 and created a bridge that older aircraft had previously done successfully. Earlier reports suggested there would be two variants in the program. You're looking at a range of around that 5,000 nautical mile mark, with a capacity that would be very similar to some of your 757 and 767 variants. With hindsight, the jet would have gone up against offerings such as the now released A321XLR and attempted to take on market share out of the broader A321neo program's success, possibly even posing as an option against the smaller A330-800. The one selling point for the 797, and indeed of key interest for Delta, would have been its clean sheet nature, as the jet incorporated all the latest technologies available at that point. Delta is among the few global carriers or leasing providers to have openly called for the release of a prospective 797 to elevate their own single-aisle flying capabilities. In February 2018, as NMA conversations intensified before the crashes involving MAX jets, Ed Bastian, the CEO of the airline, expressed a desire for the American manufacturer to move forward with the launch of a proposed middle-of-the-market plane. The decision to move towards a proposed 797 was primarily fueled by their firm reliance on fleet types such as the aforementioned 757 and 767. However, equally important was the knowledge at the time that these jets were beginning to show signs of age and a replacement would be necessary at some point. However, while some 787s helped replace the 767, Delta was part of a collective that felt Boeing needed to offer a more streamlined single-aisle jet, larger than the 737 MAX, that bridged the gap between the MAX and the Dreamliner to replace those above-aging twin-engine types more adequately. The enthusiasm was evident from the beginning, and it made sense. The airline had always been a long operator of your 757 and 767, and it recognised that a replacement was necessary, and with the 797 slotting between these two types, felt that it was the best option for the continued transition towards new-gen fleet types. After a quiet period and two major incidents, Delta's interest in the 797 would once more reignite in the mid to late point of 2019, with reports from Bloomberg suggesting that concrete interest in purchasing up to 200 of the type existed. The middle of the market sector has always been documented as a crucial one, analysts predicting before the turn of the decade that the market would see up to 4,000 aircraft orders in its lifetime. Therefore, there is considerable potential for Boeing to capture some of this if it had launched its own alternative. In a late 2019 interview with Bloomberg, Bastian said he actually anticipated Boeing would move ahead with the 797 and the carrier would commit to the type and progress with the retirement of some of its older planes. But while receiving support from one of the industry's largest players, the 797 never came about, at least not for the moment, with plans for the jet shelved, put on ice. The move meant ceding the middle of the market to competitor Airbus, which has had since free rein to innovate and develop planes such as that next generation A321XLR and capitalize on the available market share itself as well. Boeing's decision to not proceed with the 797, affectionately known as such, was hailed as a frustrating one for airlines, who had hoped the type's release would be the right one, who had hoped for the type's release, as, during the same point, the plane maker battled some of its most challenging periods since conception. At the end of the 2010s, following the crashes of MAX jets, Boeing's priorities shifted dramatically. A focus on innovation was no longer emphasized, as instead focus was placed on navigating the newly identified problems with production and on its most popular single-aisle jet. Meanwhile, the emergence of a global pandemic 1 year later put airlines into preservation mode, and rather than focusing on growth, they were attempting to survive. And when you pair that with the 737 MAX groundings and then delays to the 777X program as a bonus, it it meant resources were fundamentally allocated elsewhere. Boeing was left scrambling to rectify the wrongs of many years, during which safety had been set aside in favour of a laser focus on output and certification rates, to achieve all this as quickly as possible and keep up with competition while pleasing airline customers. These corners cut would come back to bite Boeing, the effects still being felt today, despite progress having been made after solid investments in the last, say, 12 or so months. All this meant that despite interest from Delta, an even leading Australian carrier of Qantas, in what a possible 797 could offer them for their own fleet renewal efforts, it was a decision that wouldn't make sense internally for the plane maker given all it was facing. Without the ability to have the NMA at Delta's disposal, now more than ever, the competitor product of the A321neo has become a staple for the US carrier's fleet and will continue to do so for decades to come. A commitment also exists for the 737 MAX, but all in all, Boeing's decision not to move ahead with the 797 has seen Delta put more reliance on Airbus to power its fleet across the long term. Additionally, the prospect of an order for over 200 planes was then not converted to, say, just the 737 MAX, with Airbus also securing part of the future flying commitment. Despite all this, given what Boeing was encountering at the time, analysts say that an NMA launch still to this day would not have made sense, despite there definitely being demand for it. Keen to hear your take on Delta's interest in the 797 and obviously the decision on Boeing's part to not progress with the aircraft. How do you believe the 797 would have gone on to benefit Delta had everything aligned for them? Let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a couple of days for more industry analysis.
And we'll fly.